Hello, I'm Henry Bonsu, and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's got you talking on social media and beyond. Joining me today are David Collins, Professor of International Economic Law at London's City University, Sylvie Aboah-Bradwell, the Executive Director of the Policy Centre for African Peoples, and cultural critic Father Frank Gelly. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, new US sanctions against Turkey, Iran and Russia have sent financial markets into turmoil. The Turkish lira is in freefall, losing some 38% of its value against the dollar this year, with the fall accelerated by the ongoing dispute with the United States over Turkey's detention of an American pastor, and several Western corporations, including the French oil giant Total, have pulled out of Iran. Analysts in Europe and the Middle East have accused Washington of using its economic muscle to bully other sovereign nations. Some suggest they've brought sanctions, once seen as an international expression of moral disapproval, into disrepute. It was all very different in previous decades when sanctions and boycotts were applied with near unanimity to racist white minority governments in Africa. Back then, resistance movements like the ANC called upon the international community to apply sanctions to their own country. But now they're increasingly being used wildly to settle regional scores, as witnessed in the dispute between Qatar and its neighbours, which have boycotted the emirate for over a year. So while the threshold for imposing sanctions used to be pretty high, some say that they're now being imposed so wantonly they're losing their weight and moral purpose, with the real victims being ordinary people. Now, a panel, I'm going to run the definition of sanctions by you, and it's from the Cambridge English Dictionary, and it says that a sanction is, and I quote, you're all looking at me with fear, don't worry, you can relax, it is an official order such as the stopping of trade that is taken against a country in order to make it obey international law. Now, I'm just wondering what you make of that definition. Prof. David, I'm going to start off with you. What do you make of that definition, to obey international law?
So the idea behind that definition is that you place politics above economics. So the basis of the global economy that we have, the world trading system, is that we need to have open barriers to trade, and this leads to prosperity because nations are able to specialize in what they're best at and trade for other things, and this brings wealth and prosperity. And that, according to that definition, which I agree with the definition makes sense, is that you subrogate that to the political will, meaning that there are political issues, there are social issues, which are more important than economic progress. So you breach the terms of free trade that we have under World Trade Organization rules or free trade agreements in order to achieve a political end.
Okay. And do you think that they can be a good thing? I mean, because you're not going to war and you're not saying laissez-faire, you're doing something in between.
Yes, and for the simple reason that it's better to have an economic sanction regardless of whatever harm it imposes on the people that are intended to suffer by it or others, rather than military intervention. So as an alternative to military intervention, it's absolutely a good idea. Whether or not they work is another question.
We'll come to that, I think, during the next few minutes. Sylvia, what do you think? What do you make of that definition, first of all? You know, so an official order taken against a country in order to make it obey international law.
I think, as Davy has rightly pointed out, it's about using economical means in order to achieve political ends. But I think the word international in the definition is misleading, because as we know, for decades, there has always been the misuse of sanctions by powerful countries in order to achieve their own interests, and not usually for the international community as a whole. And basically for me, there has always been three main problems with sanctions as such. Number one, it's usually powerful countries bullying smaller countries. And number two, usually, it's not really a moral thing, it's more about individual countries pursuing their personal interest.
Or maybe they're intervening into the trade of another country because they feel that country is behaving badly to its own people.
Really, that's debatable in the sense that whether it's Iran or whether it is Korea and so on, it has always been very subjective. What do I mean by that? Right now, there are sanctions against Iran taken by United States because they basically do not agree with the people who are in power right now. Why do I say that? Because in the 1950s, when a democratically elected government in Iran was overthrown with the support of the United States, there weren't sanctions imposed. So where is the morality in that?
Okay, thank you. And we're talking about morality. Well, we have a moral figure here, Father Frank Gelly. I always come to you with that preamble. What about that definition? And do you think that sanctions can be a good thing?
Sanctions are part of a general concept of punishment. Now, punishment, the root meaning of the word punishment comes from the Latin pena, which means a pain.
Yes.
So the purpose of a sanction is to make someone suffer. Now, the trouble with that is sometimes the people who suffer in an atrocious way are the innocent. The classical case is the case of sanctions against Iraq after the first Gulf War. Madeleine Albright, who was Clinton's Secretary of State, declared in a famous, infamous interview that, confronted with the fact that 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of the sanctions, or starvation and malnutrition, she said it was a price worth paying.
Right.
Some people dispute the figure, but she did not dispute it. She said it was a price worth paying. Now, how on earth can we talk about morality, a moral purpose, when we have a kind of result? I would say the immorality of sanctions in that case. Okay,
so you're mentioning a very, very, very powerful example that a lot of people say was an example of the immorality of sanctions over a period of time from 1990 to 2003. What about these examples? Because people often rally around these examples to say that they show the united international community acting with great moral force. So, for example, the UN sanctions against Rhodesia from 1966 into the late 70s, the UN sanctions against South Africa from 1986 to 1994. In those two cases, we had countries running apartheid-state regimes against their own people.
Yes, those cases are incontrovertible.
Was there moral force in
are incontrovertible, but we're not. Those cases are not the issue at the moment. Today we're discussing sanctions on Iran, sanctions on Russia, which are on specious grounds, which arise out of a political drive and of strategic and imperialist considerations, like in the case of this country. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has spoken of malignant influence of Russia. Now, that is quite a big deal coming from someone representing a country which was always regarded as perfidious Albion.
Right, but we're talking about 2018, and there are opposition movements in Russia who want action to be taken against their government and against very senior very senior figures close to President Putin. But Sylvie wanted to come in.
Yes, Frank is basically right in terms of doubting the morality of the sanctions. But I will even go further. As you mentioned there, in Russia, for instance, there are opposition groups that would like sanctions imposed on Russia. But is it really the place of the so-called international communities to influence what's going on in Russia? Because, as I said...
Because it's Russia or because it's a sovereign nation?
It's not so much that it's a sovereign nation, but because we know that always the way we deal with other countries is influenced by our experience and our prejudices. So, really, if there are sanctions against Russia, it's usually influenced by the fact that we already have a lot of negative perceptions. I am not seeing Russia as this wonderful, friendly country. Yeah. I am just saying that there are different points of views, and I do not see a big moral authority there taking the lead, because we know that United States that is leading the calls for sanctions against Russia, and the same thing with Great Britain. We all have already some interest there, and I am not sure that the results that will be achieved will be for the interest of the Russians.
Thank you very much, you too. David, I'll come to you in just a moment or two. But let's double down, as it were, into this, because the reason why sanctions are back in the news are, of course, because of the fresh US action. We've been talking about Turkey, Iran and Russia. So let's think about this. Washington's going after Turkish steel and aluminium, Iranian gold, its financial sector, its car industry and its oil industry. The US is also ramping up its ongoing embargo on 200 Russian companies, banks, government officials, those oligarchs I mentioned, close to President Putin. And then you've got the ongoing measures against China, Venezuela, and of course Cuba. It's led Iran's Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, to accuse the US of being addicted to sanctions, and even American think tanks fear the United States is going too far.
I think it's a continuation of a trend we've seen in the past couple of years, that administrations from both parties see sanctions as an effective tool to achieve foreign policy ends. It's less destructive and costly than military intervention. You can cause a lot of economic pain quite quickly, and it shows that you're doing something about a particular problem. So they've always been, over the past few years, very popular by US presidents, but now we're seeing even a more aggressive stance, sanctioning more entities. However, if you use them too much, if you use them too recklessly, if you don't have allies on board when you use them, you erode their effectiveness over time. If the rest of the world doesn't see the rationale for why you're using a particular sanction at a particular time, they may decide it's not worth their while to comply with them. Now, what we're doing now, or what the administration is doing now, is I think ignoring some of those lessons. They're using sanctions very unilaterally. They're threatening not only US adversaries, but also US allies.
And talking of US allies and partners, the EU is none too impressed with the way the US withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. It says it's ready to protect European firms threatened by secondary US sanctions for trading with Iran.
We in the European Union updated our blocking statute. You're very much up to date with this. This is a legislation the European Union has in place to protect European businesses from the effect of secondary sanctions, of sanctions that the US imposes outside of its territory. We believe that it is, and it has to be, up to the Europeans in this case to decide with whom to trade with. So there is also a matter of, I would say, trade sovereignty to be protected. This blocking statute has now been updated, so the legislation in Europe protects European businesses from the effect of the US sanctions, indicating to these companies that they should comply with European legislation rather than with American one.
Well, despite Federica Mogherini's reassurances, several major European firms have already pulled out of Iran, including the oil giant Total. And David, I'm just wondering, I mean, we've got these blocking statutes, which the EU has introduced to protect European firms, but I don't think they feel protected, which is why they're pulling out of Iran, even though they've invested large amounts of money. Is the problem that international law, such as it is, isn't really clear? Do we know what the rules are?
Well, the rules under international law regarding sanctions are outlined in the UN Charter, and the emphasis there is on economic sanctions rather than militaristic sanctions. That's the starting point. Under WTO law, you have Article 21, which is the essential security provision, which allows countries to break their world trade obligations if there's a political reason, and that's strengthened by a UN resolution, but you don't have to have a UN resolution of the GATS for the services agreement. So the material is there in international law, and it's very much the purview of each state, each country, to decide whether or not they feel that their essential security or their political interests are served by engaging in the sanctions, which again would otherwise break their trade commitments. So that's really the framework under international law, and then you have the extent to which that's compatible with domestic legal systems, such as what the EU is doing and the resolution, the statutory amendments that the US is passing.
So if you're a German or French firm that's invested in Iran since 2015 and you want to do business there, you like the welcome you got from the government, but then you've got President Trump and his team saying, if you stay in Iran after fall 2018, you will not be able to do business with us. You have to pay a fine. I mean, if you're a business, you'll be thinking, can I afford to take the heat? And you'll be wondering whether or not you really are protected by the European Union. And is this what brings some of the modern sanctions into disrepute?
Well, therein is the problem with sanctions, is that they seem to work in the short term, because there's immediate harm that's suffered because supply chains are affected. Businesses that were there one day are suddenly not there. But over time, the effect of a sanction abates and it becomes less and less effective.
Yep.
And this is why sanction regimes that are kept in place for years and years become essentially useless. What happens is the target country reestablishes its economy towards suppliers from countries that weren't affected by this, that weren't subject to the sanction regime. So a country can adapt fairly quickly. It can adapt more effectively if it already has a diverse economy. This is one of the reasons why the sanctions against Russia were somewhat more effective, because its economy relied so heavily on the oil sector. Mm-hmm. So if you have a nimble economy that can adapt and the sanctions are in place for many, many years, they really start to become pointless. And this is when we start to say, why do we have this? Why do we have these continuing? Has there really been that much thought put into it? And
right.
Of course, they're more effective the more countries you can get to participate in them,
sure.
Which is where the UN comes in.
Maybe it helps when you've got a moral force
absolutely,
behind
but
it.
then the problem then is it takes longer to get them organized.
Yep.
So if the target country can anticipate that the sanctions will take place, again, they can pre-adapt,
yes.
and reduce the damage that's done.
Right. Sylvia, you can come back in just a moment or two, so can you, Frank. But in the meantime, I mean, embargoes affect hundreds of millions of people around the world, so it's not surprising that's reflected on social media. And here's what some of you have been saying on Twitter, first of all. And we'll start off with Oni, who says, do sanctions work? Well, number one, the Castros have been in power in Cuba since 1959. 2, Mugabe survived decades of sanctions. And 3, if Abacha didn't kick the bucket, would he still be in power today? And we have this from Michelle, who says, sanctions do not work. They don't cause people to pressure their own government. They blame the ones sanctioning them. And finally this from Jane, who says, economic sanctions can be a great political tool if used correctly. However, the frequency that the current US administration uses them is diminishing their value. And we have this on Facebook from Chess, and it's a big one. Chess says, sanctions left and sanctions right. Financial, taxes, tariffs, visas, travel bans, confiscation of foreign assets, import and export prohibitions, and limitations. Looks like a last-ditch effort to bring down international trade. But in favour of what? Make America great again? Remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram by using the handle DoublingDownTV. Okay, panel, so far we've been concentrating on US sanctions, but of course there are others out there. You've got the embargo against Qatar by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE and Bahrain, which has just entered its second year. And in fact, its airline, Qatar Airlines, has posted a substantial loss. But I think you were speaking to this before, David. It survived partly by adapting and establishing new trade routes with Iran, Turkey and Oman. Sylvia, have you got any thoughts on other sanctions regimes out there, because there are many, it's not just the US?
Yes, basically I think the problem we are having right now is the personalization of a lot of sanctions. It's basically pursuing politics through all the means of sanctions. In the case of the GCC countries in the Gulf
Cooperation Council, yeah.
Yes, it's basically the new Saudi prince trying to showcase how strong and how wonderful he is by bullying small Qatar. And really, there is a way of trying to ask people to really obey what they want to do. And I don't think it's a way of having a moral way of going forward. I don't think so at all.
So no morality in that particular case?
It's just personalization of sanctions, and it can't really have positive outcomes in my view.
But the Saudis and their Gulf neighbours, David, do say that they are concerned about the politics and I suppose the way in which Qatar has been extending its influence in the region, which is why they want to cut them off at the knees.
Well, with respect to Qatar, I'm delighted that Qatar is using the World Trade Organization system to challenge the sanctions. So just to be clear on this point, you can break your trading obligations under the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, on the basis of national security, which is where sanctions come in. And Qatar has brought a challenge to the Saudi Arabian sanctions on the basis that this was not done legitimately. Yeah. It's going to be really interesting to see how the WTO courts handle that, because there's actually very thin jurisprudence on when they're justified or not as a breach of your trading obligations. And I think that will be an interesting decision if it comes out. I have a feeling it will probably settle before we get to the level of having a formal decision from the panel or the appellate body.
Frank, I'm just wondering, let me ask this of you. I mean, if the sanctions tool didn't exist, when you've got war on the one hand and laissez-faire on the other, but there's a pressing need, or a country, a sovereign country has done something terrible like invading its neighbour, i.e. 1990 Iraq and Kuwait, then what else? Well, if you don't have sanctions?
It's a false dichotomy, and of course... well,
it's one you can apply to many things we've seen around the world.
Yes, but I mean, war would be too costly and would entail problems. Just imagine a war with Russia. Yeah. Is it conceivable with a country armed with nuclear weapons? But I wanted to disagree with a statement made in the last intervention, causing people but sanctions do not cause people to pressure their own governments. Yes. Well, that depends on whether a country is totalitarian or whether it is a liberal democracy. Take a case, I want to be controversial.
Well, so you're going to attack Michelle's tweet? Okay, go for it.
I want to be controversial. Take Israel. Yeah. Now, the present administration by Netanyahu is behaving atrociously towards the Palestinians. The Gaza March, over 120 people killed, arguably over 10,000 wounded by Israeli snipers, continued occupation of the West Bank. Is there not a case, as indeed Finian McGrath, who is a minister in the Irish government, has advocated, to have sanctions imposed on Israel? After all,
there are attempts at it. There's a thing called BDS, isn't there?
Yes, BDS, yes, and the last letter is sanctions. Yeah. But until now, that has not been taken seriously. The European Union, Israel trades for a great deal with the European Unions. So if the European Unions were to impose sanctions on Israel, I support the right of Israel to exist. What I do not support is the Netanyahu administration being hell-bent on tormenting and hurting the Palestinian people.
Yeah, but a lot of Israelis, and you may have some sympathy with this, I'm not sure the other two panelists, say, well, why do you single us out? There are lots of countries around the world that have problems with population groups within, within their borders,
and nobody somewhere.
And nobody singles them out. So why single us out? Sylvia, you want to come in?
Well, I think
not
Frank,
so much on Israel, but more generally.
I think Frank is making an excellent point that by really tolerating such a huge injustice as the fact that the Palestinians have been deprived of land for so long and we haven't got big sanctions against Israel. That shows
Are you saying there's a double standard?
Exactly. That shows the double standards, and also that if a state is supported by powerful ones, the sanctions want to be applied to it. But really, I believe that sanctions cannot be the way forward in terms of solving the problems facing countries, for the simple reason that they usually end up penalizing the people we are pretending to we want to help anyway. I believe there is
What about smart sanctions, though, where you focus on individuals close to the top of the government? Frank's mocking me.
No, but go on.
This is the point I wanted to make, that if there was a way of having proper smart sanctions, that will be the way forward. But really, as we know, there are always problems.
All right, there are always problems. David, can you tidy that up for us then? On the smart sanctions.
I think we're all concerned that sanctions affect the wrong people. It's going to harm the poorest people in the country that probably aren't responsible for whatever heinous actions the relevant state is committing. So we need sanctions that affect the elite or the intelligentsia, the people that are involved in the government, that are influential, and smart sanctions ideally would achieve that. The other concern, of course, with sanctions is that, in fact, they can consolidate, they can entrench the state's behavior. There's been some suggestion that a politician can use a sanction against that country to demonstrate how greater power is needed, or it can consolidate their position and make it.
Do you have anybody in mind?
Well, I was thinking the example of the sanctions against Russia that have been used domestically by the government in Russia to show it's us against the world, and look at how the world is treating us. And interestingly, what this has done in Russia is it's actually cause some domestic Russian industry to improve itself, because it's now serving the domestic population rather than relying on trade. So businesses that might otherwise have suffered because they couldn't compete internationally are now suddenly rejuvenated. And economists would tell us that this is bad policy. In the long term, it doesn't work. Okay. But maybe that some people, some segments of the population have actually benefited from it, which is back to the point: are these things really working?
All right,
have they been structured properly?
We'll leave that question hanging pregnantly in the air, because it helps us end the programme. That's it for this week. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Professor David Collins, Sylvia Aboah-Bradwell and Father Frank Gellim. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.